Thank you so much for coming today. I'm so excited to see such a large crowd. We knew it was going to be a big crowd because Derek always draws a crowd. I'm here to represent the Chesapeake and Cumberland Land Trust. We were really excited to put this series together for all of you. We wanted people to understand what's happening locally with climate change, and not a doom and gloom series, but what can we look forward to? Maybe there's some birds that we don't normally get to see that we're going to get to see. Maybe things in Casco Bay are changing in a way that we can appreciate. And so we're really excited about having all of you understand what's happening in your backyards and in your towns and in the greater Portland region, so that you can feel more comfortable with the change that's coming and the adaptations that are occurring, and find some hope in what's coming as well. So the Land Trust is also part of climate action. So we conserve land. We've conserved 1,200 acres in the town of Cumberland and Chesapeake Island. And part of conserving land is part of climate adaptation. So what we're doing is helping with the climate crisis, and we're protecting large blocks of habitat. We are protecting our forests, which store carbon and greenhouse gases. The areas that we protect filter and absorb stormwater that are coming more frequently. And we're providing easy access to the outdoors for all of you to get out and connect with nature and enjoy it and understand it. And we are also protecting some of our local agriculture, our local farms, so that we can be eating local foods that are healthy and not traveling all the way from California. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And we have a flyer outside. So we list the things that the Land Trust is doing for climate change. And on the back are some suggestions of things that you can do as an individual. So thank you so much for being a part of what we're doing and for supporting the Land Trust. I'm thrilled today to introduce Derek Lovitch. He's our second speaker in our climate series, and Derek is a repeat presenter for CCLT. We've done a lot of bird walks out on Chesapeake Island, which are always well attended, and everybody learns so much and always leaves with something new that they've learned. So we're excited to have him here today. You might see him out on Cousins Island Bridge early in the morning, counting the migrating birds going by. So I know you have some fans that join you out there sometimes, but that's coming up soon, or has it already started? That's not told. You just do it in the fall. Okay. Well, Derek and his wife, Jeanette, live in Durham, Maine, and they own and operate Freeport Wild Bird Supply. It's a retail store that serves birders of all levels, so we encourage you to go. He loves to share his enthusiasm for birds. He leads lots of tours on Saturday mornings and other times. And he's written a couple of books, How to Be a Better Birder, which we have at our house, and it's flagged. My husband and my son flagged different pages on it. So that's a great book to take a look at. And he's also written Bird Watching in Maine, a site guide, which was published in 2017. And a lot of his writing has also appeared in magazines, and he's been birding throughout the state for 20 years. So he has a lot of information to share with us today, and especially on how our bird populations are changing here in Maine. So welcome, Derek.
Thank you, Penny. That was quite an introduction. I hope this program lives up to a little bit of the hype now. I mostly look at birds. I don't spend a lot of time with PowerPoint, so I've done a pretty basic rudimentary program. When I was asked, and thanks, Kelly, for your help with getting this set up. Appreciate that. We got through that. Sorry for the delay. When I was first approached to do this program, I said, how long do I have? There's so much we could talk about with changing bird populations in Maine. I hope this program actually creates more questions than it answers, because we need to be asking lots of questions now, and we need to be solving some of these problems. And I'm going to, at the end, give you some ideas on how we can do that starting tomorrow. There's no way I could cover it all, so I've chosen a sample of things that I think represent some of the trends. So let's start with a very basic of why climate change matters to birds. And I'm going to oversimplify everything with the theory of thermal ecology. And its tenets are these five general, the five general tenets are listed here. And certain temperatures promote activity and growth of organisms. I don't like to get out of bed on a really cold morning. Birds who don't get to put on an extra layer have that same decision to make. How populations adapt to thermal variation. In other words, if it gets real hot, what do I do? Birds can't pant, they don't sweat, or they can pant a little bit, but not like our dogs, and they can't sweat. How extreme temperatures limit the distribution of species. Essentially, is in a perfect situation, the weather is always normal and average, but regardless of climate change, that is not the case. It's always fluctuating. And how cold it could get, how hot it could get, how dry it could get, how wet it could get, are those extreme temperatures and other variations in precipitation, et cetera, that limit the area a species can occupy. Number 4 is how interactions between species shape thermal niches. If it's too cold for bugs, you got to go somewhere else if you want to eat bugs. That's the basis of long distance migration. And finally, how latitudinal changes in temperature create patterns of biodiversity. All things being equal, closer you are to the equator, the more species there are. But all this can be summarized, and the only thing that really we need to worry about for an introduction today, because this is an entire school of ecological research that I've tried to digest into one slide, which I find the Oxford Bibliographies online is a really good one-paragraph description of really technical stuff. Remember, in other words, a species can only survive within a certain temperature range. The exception is that's when there's enough food, or the exceptions to that rule are when there's enough food. A Baltimore Oriole spent the winter in Saco, Maine this winter, not because it was warmer, but because it found certain conditions, a certain feeding station that provided it so much extra food that was able to overcome what it's evolved to withstand in the winter months, which would normally be in Central and South America. But that's an exception. The future of Baltimore Orioles is not wintering in Saco, Maine, because yet, and let's hope it's not. But it does show there's exceptions. So these are not hard, fast rules, but this is the overall tenet. So if you think about all species having temperature range that they can live in, if you change the temperature, you're going to change the species that live there. There are some species that are pretty familiar to all of us. Bald eagles, Canada goose, Carolina wren. These are 3 examples of birds that are going up in population. I want to break it down, and what my plan is to use individual species that are both familiar and unfamiliar to us to give you examples of what's changing, how, and why. Northern Cardinal. If I was giving this program 40 years ago, you would probably not know, you might not know what this bird is in Maine. There weren't that many, and they were very limited to the coast. When we first opened our store 20 years ago, the number one question is, how do I get cardinals to my yard? 20 years later, it's not a question we get very often anymore. It's where all these bluebirds come from. Complete change. We love seeing cardinals in our yard. Don't get me wrong. The data supports there are a heck of a lot more cardinals now. Throughout this program, I'm going to use primarily 2 data sets. The Christmas bird count, which is a citizen science project that occurs 1 week before to 1 week after Christmas every year, which is considered a snapshot of wintering bird populations. We now know it's not a perfect snapshot of wintering birds because in mid-December, it's often not even winter here anymore. But Christmas bird counts are a good snapshot, and they're done all across the country, including most of Maine. I'm using just data from Maine. So this is Christmas bird counts in Maine from 1972 when there were enough circles. Christmas counts are conducted in a 10-mile diameter circle. There were enough to really do some good trend analysis. I am not a statistician at all. But I'm looking at, I only want to talk about big picture stuff today anyway. And there's not much to argue about. That Christmas bird count trend is a lot more. If you look at the beginning, 1972 is the first count. You had just a few. And it's birds per party hour. Don't worry about the details. It means how often people are out counting and how many individuals of those species per hour. And that is a very loose and rough calculation. All we care about is a trend, and it's up. The other data set we're going to use is the breeding bird survey. The black line is the actual count. The red lines are basically within the margin of error, the confidence levels. Just look at the general trend because we're not doing advanced statistics on this. I'm not smart enough to. But also it's not important. We see up. You've seen more cardinals now than you did 10, 20, 30 years ago. This confirms that. That's good. We like cardinals. Cardinals are increasing for various reasons. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the reasons that each species is going up and down and we'll see this sort of some things, pictures coming together towards the end here. So cardinals are a bird of the suburbs. They don't like unbroken woods. So if you have nothing but forest or nothing but potato fields, you don't have cardinals. They like the things in between. And development and forest fragmentation is great for edge species like cardinals. Because these are a southern bird moving north, which is going to be a theme you're going to hear a lot of, they do benefit from supplemental feeding when things get bad. If you have bird feeders out 2 weeks ago, and then you had bird feeders out, kept them full through that last snow and ice storm, you would have seen a big difference in when birds are at feeders. Birds are not dependent on feeders. We have scientifically debunked that since the 1970s. It's supplemental food, but that supplemental food makes a big difference when there are extreme conditions. A cardinal buried in 2 feet of snow is not going to find a lot of its natural food. It's going to go to feeders. Therefore, increase in bird feeding, which has also happened significantly since the 1960s, but especially from the 1980s on, is going to help an edge species fill the gap that is no longer available, especially with more development or more pesticides or more other things that prevent our backyards from having as much food as they could. Supplemental feeding becomes part of the equation. And of course, climate change. That thermal ecology, 50 years ago, was a lot colder here. Cardinals are a southern bird. Before we started seeing the first signs of climate change in the 70s and 80s, northern cardinals were very rare birds in Maine and were really limited to southern New England and south. Very similar, tufted titmouse, another favorite feeder bird. Those trends are hard to argue. We have a lot more titmice at our yards. Steadily going up. And it's always interesting with things like Christmas bird count. I should mention some of the differences between the Christmas bird count. There's a lot more people counting birds during a Christmas bird count, but it's a lot less statistically rigorous because people are out birding, and birding has a lot of variables that are hard to control. The breeding bird survey is very specific routes where you do a point count. You stop at a certain distance and count all the birds you hear singing, drive to the next distance. So they're done along roads. There's a bias towards edge species because it's done along roads, but also they're scattered throughout the state. So it does actually help bring in some of the more remote areas where there aren't a lot of people living in winter to go count birds at Christmas time. But when they're perfectly in line, you know that trend is real. We have 2 major data sets showing exactly the same thing. They are increasing for the same reasons cardinals are. Suburbanization, they love backyards. Bird feeding, that's supplemental food, especially in winter. And climate change, the thermal ecology. Even newer on the scene is red-bellied woodpecker. When we first opened the store, I remember, when we first moved to Maine 20 years ago, I was birding with a friend, and we went down to Kittery to chase a red-headed woodpecker, still very rare in Maine. And he was like, oh, finally got a red-bellied woodpecker for my year list. He hadn't seen one. We had to go to Kittery. Now red-bellied woodpeckers are breeding in Aroostook County within 15 years. That breeding bird survey graph is about as obvious as it gets. Absolutely none whatsoever until the mid-2000s, and then now here they are. The Christmas bird count has a sort of a lag, and you see the ups and downs in this? Because red-bellied woodpecker are dependent on oaks, and they store acorns for the winter. And some years there are more acorns than others. And in points south, when red oaks and white oaks have a down year, generally due to natural cycles, red-bellied woodpeckers spread out in the winter. Red-bellied woodpeckers who had been moving north, I grew up in central New Jersey. Red-bellied woodpeckers were around, but they were the fourth most common woodpecker on Christmas bird counts where I grew up. They are now by far the most common. That's within, say, 35 years. The Christmas bird counts count birds that have moved away from the breeding area. And so we had birds in some winters for 30 plus years, usually due to acorns failing, as we say, to the south. Or after a really good acorn year, more young birds spreading out. Something changed. And all of a sudden, after a huge eruption, we call it with an I, it means a whole bunch of birds going further than normal due to find food. All of a sudden, they came here and they just didn't leave. That's that. They just, it was, I forget exactly, 2004, I think, was the first pulse. And then it was like a 2006 or 8. I never remember dates. There was just massive increase, and they were being seen all over the state. And then, you know, they moved, but they started breeding in York County and Cumberland County. And then all of a sudden we found out there was a pair in Augusta and Phippsburg. And before that, before we know it, they're breeding throughout the southern third of the state. The only reason that red-bellied woodpecker breeding bird survey graph is so low is that they're still not found in western and northern Maine and far eastern Maine, where there are a lot of counts, while on Christmas counts are centered more towards the populations of the south and the coast. There is no difference. This was sudden, and it was really cool if you're a birder who had never seen a red-bellied woodpecker in your yard list, and I got excited by it, but it meant something. Why did all of a sudden it change? Well, this was right around the time we started seeing the first really obvious changes in climate, in thermal ecology. It got warmer. I wonder about the changing range of oaks. Oak trees forests migrate. They don't migrate as quickly as birds, but they need things like red-bellied woodpeckers and blue jays to help them migrate. Blue jays will spread an acorn up to 10 miles to hide it from its parent tree. To oversimplify things, oak forests can move 10 miles north every year. That's pretty slow in the big picture, or pretty fast in the big picture, slow in the current trends of climate change. But maybe oaks are moving north. We also have the irregularity in the acorn cycles due to things like really cold, wet springs, due to invasive insects, due to just the climate being screwy. These acorn mass are not nearly as predictable. And therefore, the red-bellied woodpeckers who would have had a population surge one year and a crash the next, they seem to be not crashing as far when they have a down year for acorns, possibly due to suburbanization and bird feeding. Our store is helping increase red-bellied woodpeckers. I'd like that. That's not a bad thing, because unlike invasive species, when native species expand, they tend to move into unoccupied niches, as opposed to excluding other species. So a starling kicks a bluebird out of a hole is bad. A red-bellied woodpecker doesn't do that. It takes an unoccupied hole, or it generally builds its own, which actually could produce more holes for bluebirds. There's something very similar to red-bellied woodpecker and Carolina wren. Carolina wren is it's an abundant bird in the southeast US. It was not abundant in New England until very recently. Look at the Christmas bird count, and again, look at that breeding bird survey data, almost exactly the same as red-bellied woodpeckers. Whatever flipped the switch in those normal ups and downs of red-bellied woodpeckers showing up, yeah, the ups got higher, but in case of Carolina wrens, this is a bird that lives in really dense thickets in winter. Monhegan Island used to have the densest population in the state, and that was true at least 15 years ago. The only thing that rivaled the amount of Carolina wrens in Monhegan was in neighborhoods in Kittery. Monhegan, being an island offshore, gets less snow depth than the mainland most years. Those swales on Monhegan, full of thick, dense, in this case, invasive plants, allow them to have winter cover and get down to find insects under the bushes. There's not as much bird feeding on Monhegan in the winter as there is in Kittery, but that supplemental food probably helped. It was too coincidental that explosion of breeding population occurred at the same time. We've been growing bird feeding since the 60s and 70s. We've been growing invasive. We've had invasive plants on Monhegan and in thickets in Kittery. Something has changed. And in the case of Carolina wrens, if we had done a survey of just Monhegan as a perfect example, some of the ups and downs of that Christmas bird count would be shown in the snowiest winters. If you get a ton of snow, Carolina wrens disappear from your yards. Some perish, others may simply fly further south, or they find a thicket somewhere else. But I've noticed as a tour guide who leads tours on Monhegan, after a really bad snowy winter, it's harder to see a Carolina wren on Monhegan. It's pretty obvious there, the good years and bad years. That's why I put climate change up at the top for Carolina wren, is that milder winters and less snow allow more Carolina wrens to survive. Suburbanization also helps them. They are not a bird of the unbroken forest or the farmland. Invasive plants, I put a question mark there because they like really dense thickets. That's good out of desperation, but it may also be limiting how they could survive in the winter because invasive plants don't provide them food. It might provide a structure for shelter to ride out a snowstorm. So I think that has some effect. I just don't know how. And of course, bird feeding. And once again, we have seen this continuing trend, which is a theme of southern birds spreading north. Certainly the most common topic of conversation at our store right now are eastern bluebirds. I see a lot of people nodding. There is not much question, again, an explosion of eastern bluebirds as year-round residents in Maine. Look at the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey. It is pretty consistent, and the breeding bird survey, so I'll notice this in some of the breeding bird surveys. There's a big pulse in the 90s and 2000s for some other species that buck a trend either up or down. That makes me think maybe routes changed, maybe coverage changed, something here. So if I was a statistician, I would be looking at a curve that looks more like this, ignoring these peaks and decreases because it's just one data set. And I don't really trust it. It's a little too consistent. There's also, we'll see in some of the counts, the 113th Christmas count, which was 10 years ago, massive drops in every count. My guess it was really cold, snowy, and icy, and people didn't get out that week that the counts are occurring. That's why we're only looking at long-term, broad-scale trend analysis. There is not much question we're seeing this pattern here. Now I'm going to throw out another variable for eastern bluebirds. It's we're taking care of them. This is great news on every level. If we go back historically, before starlings, European starlings and house sparrows were introduced, before we started cutting down windbreaks, we may have had more bluebirds than suggested by that graph. However, there's not tons of evidence of that. It does seem like they're colonizing. However, the only way they can colonize, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button there. The only way they can colonize is if we take care of their birdhouses. They're reliant almost exclusively on birdhouses, and we've learned a lot in the last 30 years about how to keep bluebirds happy and reduce competition with the European starlings, how to minimize competition with house sparrows, which is a bigger problem. And this is actually a whole different lecture, one I'll be giving for the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust next week. I could go off and talk about bluebird housing and everything, but this is what we're talking about at a store every day, and I don't want to go off on too many tangents, which, as Penny could assure you, I'm really good at, just going off on a story. So I'll just leave it at that. Climate change, again, a southern bird moving north. Deforestation, not a bird of open forest. But also, they do seem to be becoming more suburbanized. And often I'll put an asterisk when it's just my own hypothesis. There's a group of species that all of a sudden seem to be tolerating smaller and smaller territories. Bluebird is one of those. Our standard answer at the store is, what do I need for bluebirds to nest in? And we say 1 to 2 acres of open space. I've seen them nesting in small quarter-acre lots now. They need to go forage in your open space, but they seem to be adapting to smaller territories. And that's a whole nother story that we could talk about, backyard habitat. I also do that program. Canada goose, for better or for worse. There's that big dip at the 113th count. That had to be an ice storm or something that caused a lot of birds to move out. I didn't go back to look at weather data. That spike in 85, I'm guessing, was a very mild winter. But looking at the trends, there are a lot more Christmas bird counts in winter, or a lot more Canada geese on Christmas bird counts, a consistent increase, but a fairly sudden increase in the breeding bird survey. This is all on us. We did this because in the 50s and 60s, state game agencies, and in Maine, it actually occurred into the early 80s, I believe, were introducing Canada geese. The idea was that we wanted to provide year-round hunting. Arguably, it was for putting food on the table, but really it was for quote-unquote sport. The idea that you take Canada geese, unlike almost every other type of bird, waterfowl have to be taught how to migrate. So what game agencies throughout North America and the world did was they raised some geese in captivity or took the eggs out of the wild, grew them up, and clipped the end of their wings so they couldn't fly south, called pinioning. Doesn't hurt them. They just couldn't gain enough lift to go very far. They then released them. The adults raised young. They didn't mind breeding on a pond anywhere in the state. And they didn't go anywhere. The young didn't learn how to migrate. They just flew to the closest patch of open water. And that's all they had to go. All of a sudden, we had a lot more open water. And all of a sudden, they didn't have to go very far. And all of a sudden, our fields didn't have snow cover all winter. Thornhurst Farm in North Yarmouth is a local goose watching hotspot. Canada geese now live on that field year round. And if we get a snowstorm, they fly to Broad Cove, generally spend the night there, and they might spend a couple days until those edges start to defrost. With the decreased snowfall, after we brought Canada geese in, we let them go. They started breeding. We developed things. They love a good golf course. Condo complexes, that perfectly shortcut grass that slopes right up to the water's edge. We basically recreated Arctic tundra when we did that. If you don't want geese breeding in your condo complex or on your golf course, don't make it look like the high Arctic in summer. Simple as that. Climate change, the open water. So I remember when I first, I'll date myself, but that when my wife and I moved to Maine, we were unemployed. So our only option was to live on Munjoy Hill. So if you know Portland, you know that dates yourself a little bit. So I remember walking to the Eastern Promenade in Back Cove, and yeah, you would see some geese in midwinter. Now you can see 1,000 in a good day. And that's because they just fly to the high school fields. They feed on the cove. And if they ever finish that construction at the parking lot, they'll be feeding on that field again. Interestingly enough, we wonder actually are migrants, real Canadian Canada geese. Canadian geese is actually not technically correct, but unless they're from Canada, they're Canadian. Canadian Canada geese are showing signs of decreasing, possibly due to climate change on the Arctic tundra and perhaps issues with eating not as great food when they're in farm fields further south, but it seems to be more tundra related. So that's concerning because you get the perception geese are doing great, but they are because they've adapted to these introduced birds have adapted to us, but the true migrants may not be doing that well. Cooper's hawks, they like to hang out at feeders. Cooper's hawk is, again, this gets a little more complicated. I could probably give an hour lecture on the populations of any of these species. Here I'm going to throw out another data set, the Bradbury Mountain Spring Hawk Watch. Our store has sponsored, my wife and I have run since 2008, and we count migratory birds of prey. Birds of prey are notoriously hard to count in the breeding bird survey because they don't want you to know where they nest. And on Christmas bird counts, they can be very secretive in winter because they're not calling and they're not always conspicuous. So we use migration counts to look for a sample of trends. So the Cooper's hawk we have a lot more of in Maine. You can see by the Christmas bird count. Again, that one bad year, I'm sure, was after an ice storm. We have more based on the breeding bird survey, but our hawk watch has actually showed a slight decrease. I think that might be more to do with the biases of hawk watching, specifically our changing weather patterns. We're not getting as much west and southwest winds, and that's important for us to count migratory accipiters in particular. So I'm not going to really worry about that. For example, 2023 last year was a bad year at our hawk watch because we had persistent east winds from these coastal storms that never occurred and lasted for 3 days and blew onshore winds and eroded our shoreline, that affects our hawk counts. I think that decreasing trend has more to do with weather changes and how obnoxiously persistent east winds have become in spring. But overall, they are definitely increasing. How does climate change affect Cooper's hawks? We don't really know unless it's just simple the thermal ecology, but we're still trying to figure out why Cooper's hawks are increasing. They like fragmented forests. They don't like deep, unbroken woods. So they like it when an old farm field becomes abandoned and grows back to trees, as a lot have in this area. They need forests, but they've also, skip down to the end, sometime in the 90s, I remember this in college and having a debate with my ornithology professor about an accipiter that was nesting on campus. Because he said, no, sharp-shinned hawks are much more likely to nest in a small woodlot in a campus. And that used to be true, but all of a sudden Cooper's hawks shifted to suburbia. That may be because of bird feeding. You have mixed sparrow fly through in every third yard, you're gonna have more bird-eating hawks. Sharp-shinned hawks, which we'll talk about later, are declining. Some have argued Cooper's hawks are the reason. I don't buy it. Simply, I don't believe in nature A equals B often enough for me to say more Cooper's hawks, less sharp-shins. I think Cooper's hawks are spreading north because they were the more southern of the two, spreading north like everything else, taking over the unoccupied niche of a bird-eating hawk, as sharp-shins are reducing in population, which we'll look at later. But again, gets a little more complicated. Not complicated. This is no longer an endangered species. Anyone who's been on bird walks with me knows I swear at these more often than not anymore, because they're usually interrupting my observation of something else as they fly over. In fact, the reason Thornhurst Farm in North Yarmouth is not as good for geese as it used to be is that there's bald eagles patrolling it almost every day, causing the geese to move a lot more and not being as comfortable there as they once were. There's pretty obvious trends here, and with our hawk watch showing a perfect trend, a slight of the consistent increase. Here we did do the statistics of the trend analysis because hawk watches in general are so variable based on weather of how many the count is. Those ups and downs are actually a sign of what the weather was, not anything to do with population. But bald eagle is showing a consistent increase that really nicely matches the Christmas bird count and breeding bird survey. When all these correlate so well, we can be confident the population is increasing. Bald eagles are definitely coming back from the DDT era and as well as PCBs. The reduction of those and the lack of putting more into the environment has clearly protected these. Bald eagles have our Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is arguably the strongest environmental law we have. You can't even, you're committing a felony by picking up a bald eagle feather. Even if you drop it, that's a felony. You're not going to be prosecuted for it, in theory. But that's how protected they are. So that's great. That helps. And this is a great conservation success story. Admittedly, part of the reason there's so many is they love landfills, bait piles, fishing and hunting waste, other things that provides easy food for overwinter survival. Some have long-term consequences as well. Increasing prey sources due to climate change. We have more small and medium mammals. We have possums now. There are more raccoons and skunks. There are more deer to eat, to feed off a roadkill. There are more, and deer are a big part of the increasing bald eagle population because they're primarily scavengers. Less snow cover means they could spend time in a field eating voles if they have to. Bald eagles are very opportunistic, and they'll take advantage of everything, including our increasing osprey populations, because they'll actually steal the fish that ospreys have caught. Bald eagles will catch their own fish sometimes, but it's a lot easier to chase an osprey until it gives it up. In the wonderful word for trivia night, kleptoparasitism. The parasitation by theft, living off another by theft, to not use the word, to find the word. Also, all those Canada geese that I talked about spending the winter, all the American black ducks that now spend the winter, that's all potential bald eagle food. The more open water is allowing them hunting opportunities, and fewer are migrating. When we started the Hawk Watch on March 15th, we didn't see a bald eagle. But now we will see, I think this year on March 16th, the first day was rained out, we had 3 courting pairs in the air at one time on day one. Ospreys. also increasing. Our hawk watch is showing that slight decline again. I think this is also weather related, but I'm starting to worry about this trend because it may be a sign of what's happening north of us, where the breeding bird surveys and Christmas bird counts, well, Christmas bird counts don't matter for ospreys because they don't winter in Maine yet. When I grew up, they didn't winter in New Jersey, and now they're common in Cape May in some winters. The breeding bird survey is showing a very steep increase, or a recent steep increase, but we're worried about these birds and pesticide contamination that hasn't gone away, and additional pesticide use. Neonicotinoid pesticides, I personally believe, will make DDT era look like a walk in the park, and they are ubiquitous from your backyard to agriculture. We're starting to worry a little bit about chemical contamination in ospreys. And the reason I put this up here, even though it's sort of, bucking the trend of consistency here, is this one worries me because hawk watches in the early 1900s through the mid 1950s were the first detection of our plummeting raptor populations, first due to shooting, then due to chemicals. So I'm going to keep an eye on this count, and I hope it's just our wind conditions. The reduction of DDT in particular and the minimization of the breakdown product DDE have helped increase productivity of ospreys. They are legally protected, as are all raptors now. We have more potential places for an osprey to nest than we ever did before. Channel markers, mooring buoys, telephone poles put up intentionally with a piece of plywood on top. We have a lot more infrastructure that ospreys could build a nest on. Before, they had to compete for the best trees. I also think fish stocking might have something to do with it because we throw a whole lot of really stupid fish into our rivers. And I mean, they're not bred for their street smarts, but now there's densities where places are stocked and increasing populations of introduced fish on ponds and lakes may be helping ospreys colonize otherwise deeper water locations, for example, and rivers. Turkey vulture. That one is clear. I don't have a Christmas bird count data here because as of about 5 years ago, I believe, there hadn't been one recorded on a Christmas bird count. This year, we had overwintering turkey vultures in at least a half dozen spots in the state, including one or two that consistently worked 295 between Falmouth and Freeport. And you could see those one or two birds, the local street crew, working up and down, feeding on whatever got hit the night before, probably a deer. Without turkey vultures, we would probably not be here because the amount of diseases that would have spread from rotting carcasses, maybe even as recently as the last ice age, let alone now with all the deer that would be piled up. They're really important for the ecology and for human health. There's not much question here about how rapidly that bird is increasing in Maine. Before 1980, they were very rare. Their heads have no feathers. If it gets cold, your head is naked, they can't put on a hat. They tuck their head under their wing, but they can only do that while sleeping. They're flying without a hat on in the middle of winter. If it's really cold, they lose a lot of energy that way. There's no way a milder climate isn't going to help a bird that has a naked head. It seems pretty simple. Also, there's less snow burying carcasses. At the end of deer season 30 years ago, if a bait pile was left in the woods, it was probably covered in snow in a couple weeks. Now it may not be covered in snow at all. And of course, that decreased snowfall is increasing things and accessibility to other carcasses, especially small mammals that are increasing with development, suburbanization, and sprawl. And the more mammals that are around us, the more that are getting hit by more cars. That's good if you're a turkey vulture. Not great if you're a small mammal, except your populations will recover from roadkill for now because they are fecund or make a lot of them. All right, that was some of the birds that are increasing. I think most of us who pay attention to the natural world have seen those birds. The problem is the birds that are increasing tend to be around development and conspicuous. Cardinals are increasing. Was anyone here shocked at any of those birds having increased? Like, oh, I don't see those anymore. I thought they were declining. Yeah, they're familiar and common. And that is all great for those birds. The problem is most birds are not familiar and common. Maine has, you could argue, I think it's somewhere like 450 species recorded in all time. We have about 350 regular occurring migratory birds, including annual rarities, somewhere between 325, 350 a year. There are a lot of birds that aren't in our backyards. That keeps me in business as a tour guide. I don't need to get paid to show you a cardinal anymore. But there are other species that are decreasing. I've already talked the program, I don't know if we started this program 45 minutes ago or if the clock's been running since we first opened PowerPoint. I could talk all day about decreasing species. The reality is there's much more decreasing than increasing. But because they're not as common and conspicuous, they often can go unnoticed. I tried to do a selection that represented some of the threats and issues we're having. Yellow-rumped warbler is still an abundant bird as a breeding bird. I wanted to focus in winter. It's on its way out in winter. This is one of the only birds whose winter range is retracting out of Maine. We are at the northern limits of its wintering range, probably since the last ice age. They're now virtually gone in Maine in winter. And that's because the eastern population of yellow-rumped warbler is known as the myrtle warbler. The myrtle warbler eats myrtle. Myrtle's a group of native plants. The northernmost is northern bayberry. We talk about this on our Chebeague walks when we go down to Indian Point, and I always point out the bayberry being covered by invasive species. Oops. We're losing yellow-rumped warbler as a wintering bird because we're losing bayberry. And those up and downs are the years bayberry produce more fruit than others because they, like many things, are cyclical. And it's almost every other year bayberry has a mass crop of fruit. This bird, called the myrtle warbler, because its entire native historic wintering range fully encompasses the genus Myrica, which are the myrtles. There is no better name for a warbler than the myrtle warbler because they need that plant to survive. The loss of undeveloped shorelines, sand dune habitat, means we lose northern bayberry, and we're also now having that bayberry covered by invasive plants. This is directly relevant. I tried to bring in a few examples that are directly relevant to the work the Land Trust is doing, because at Indian Point, there are healthy bayberry, and we always point it and smell it and enjoy it. But that's how yellow-rumped warbler will survive on Chebeague Island in the winter. You go down to Old Orchard Beach, you're not finding yellow-rumped warbler anymore because there's no bayberry left in any dunes. There are no dunes. There's still one stretch in Ogunquit Beach, happens to be in my wife and I's Christmas bird count territory, that has a healthy bayberry thicket. And in years that have bayberry, we can see quite a few yellow rumps there. American kestrel. The declines are not always as obvious. The Breeding Bird Survey in Maine has shown a precipitous decline, which has matched a lot of other places and a lot of other data sets. But our Hawk Watch is showing a slight increase. This could be a sign of kestrel's ranges shifting north. Don't have data to support it because we're the farthest north and east regularly conducted full season hawk count on the eastern seaboard in the spring. So we don't have someone north of us to check this. However, we do know it's disappearing from Maine precipitously, and there's a bunch of reasons. Essentially, this is mostly to do with both development and reforestation. Maine has more forest cover now than it did, is it 100 years ago, 200? But we also have a lot more development. Kestrels don't live unbroken forest, but what they do love is when we opened up a cattle pasture and we left a big old tree standing in the middle, and that tree would have a dead snag or would die, and a northern flicker would make a hole one year, and the next year the kestrel would live in that hole. Northern flickers are in steep decline. Northern flickers make holes that kestrels depend on. Flickers decline, kestrels decline. Flickers need big old trees in farms and open space. We don't, in our more intense agriculture, we don't use windbreaks anymore as a primary tool of soil conservation and moisture conservation. We maximize every square inch. Those old windbreaks or a tree sheltering a cow pasture are really important wildlife habitat for birds of semi-open locations. American kestrels winter as in the southeast U.S., occasionally this far north, but mostly southeast U.S. into Central America, where we have more development. We also have a lot of chemical use. Pesticides we're in a extinction crisis of insects. The insect apocalypse is what it's being called scientifically. And when you have academic scientists using words like apocalypse, it's probably a bad sign. Kestrels eat primarily large insects. My wife and I travel every few years to Atlanta, Georgia for a winter trade show, really an excuse to go birding and eat barbecue. And we'll go birding and there's acres and hundreds of acres of cotton fields. And you'll see kestrels on the wires. But there's also an increased use of chemicals in cotton fields and every other field. And those are killing those insects and causing potential accumulation issues, like we saw with DDT in bald eagles. There are more hazards for kestrels in migration, lighted towers, wind turbines, other things that cause collision. But I also think chemical use in South America on the wintering grounds, which has increased dramatically, is having an effect. Cooper's hawks get blamed for a lot. Cooper's hawks will eat a kestrel. There was a paper that came out 20, 30 years ago that said in this certain area, Cooper's hawks had killed all the kestrels. I think that's nonsense because Cooper's hawks and kestrels don't have the same preferred habitat. Kestrels want big open farmland. Cooper's hawks want semi-open forest to urbanization. Those don't overlap well. So if you change the habitat, one predator will move in, but the last few kestrels probably were taken out by Cooper's hawks in that study area. This is a bird near and dear to my heart because I count these and I spend a lot of time looking at these in winter. And I also spend a lot of time arguing with state biologists about what we need to do about it because their answer is nothing. My answer is something, anything, please. I love Barrow's goldeneye. It's just a bird I've always been attracted to. In South Freeport, we have the southernmost wintering flock on the East Coast. When we first started doing Saturday morning bird walks 19 winters ago, the high count was 26 Barrow's goldeneye in a flock. This winter, I had 7, which is delightful because most winters recently have been 3 or 4. Belfast Harbor used to have 24, now has 0. The Christmas bird counts, you see that, so there was an increase in the 90s, and this may have been observer bias. We had more observers, more skilled observers, more people saying, hey, I should include this circle. There was a big increase in our circles, and I wonder if that caused this increase. It could have also been a spell of milder winter, of colder winters. The argument from the state is that essentially Barrow's goldeneyes are not actually decreasing, but they're not coming as far south for the winter because they don't need to. And I think that's absolutely correct. That is probably the primary reason. However, why are there still 7 in Freeport when there used to be 24? Why are there none in Belfast Harbor when there used to be 0? They have very high winter site fidelity, and once a Barrow's goldeneye finds a place to winter, they'll come back for a decade. There was one female for my first 20 years of birding. I saw exactly one Barrow's goldeneye, the same female that overwintered in Sandy Hook Bay in New Jersey for I think it was like 14 years. She came back every year. That's where she spent the winter. Some of these decreases have occurred after Hydro-Quebec, which flooded a lot of rivers in eastern Quebec. The biggest, though, the local factors are reduced ice. And I could watch this because when my wife and I like to go birding up in Orono in the winter. 10 years ago, that river was solid frozen north of Bangor. Now we see Barrow's goldeneyes on the river in Orono off the Maine campus. There may just be fewer coming south, but we don't have surveys in, say, the St. Lawrence River and St. Lawrence Estuary, Gulf of St. Lawrence to prove it. So therefore, I think we need to be protecting the ones that are here. And while hunting is not a primary issue for the population, it could cause local declines. And I think that's part of the equation in Freeport. Also, green crabs. Barrow's goldeneye, like most diving ducks, eat small shellfish. There are lots fewer small shellfish in the Harrisseeket River, presumably due to green crabs, although it's hard to separate from climate change, warmer water, higher acidification. Don't quite know what's happening here other than they're disappearing from Maine as a wintering bird. A lot of birds eat green crabs. I've never seen a goldeneye, barrows, or a common eat a green crab. Ruffed grouse. This one was a bird I had in Freeport that actually took a liking to me and tried to copulate with my shoulder repeatedly. The video, I wanted to do the video, but I never try videos in presentations anymore. It's just, yeah. That one was a little confused. I think it liked my brown boots. It's the only thing. So Christmas bird counts have shown this steady decline, while the breeding bird survey has shown fairly level. And I think that's because ruffed grouse are doing really well statewide. They're just not doing well in southern and coastal Maine. And that would be more reflected in Christmas bird counts. That's because they have a real issue with forest fragmentation. They need a lot of forest and a lot of edge in between and really old orchards and other things. The problem around people is we introduce predators like cats, as well as actual natural predators that increase around us, like fox and coyotes, all of which like ruffed grouse. Outdoor cats hammer ruffed grouse because fluffy young that run around, they can't fly away. Entire coveys will be wiped out by one feral cat. There are more of those, and there are more of native predators around us, which is part of the reason ruffed grouse don't do as well in fragmented forest. Interestingly enough, this is a bird that is really impacted, but even though it's a ground bird, it's being impacted by less snow, because in snowy periods, ruffed grouse basically bury themselves in the snow. And they basically burrow under a bush, and they'll be insulated for the worst of a snowstorm. If you get an ice storm and you don't have 12 inches of snow to bury yourself in, you're exposed to the elements. They also, I think, are getting hammered by these periods of cold, wet weather in the spring. Not now, but when they're breeding in May and June. We never had June nor'easters before. Now we'll have 3 or 4 days of constant rain, like my entire week tour to Rangeley last summer, where it rained every day. It was annoying for birding, but guess what? If I was a downy ruffed grouse, it would be deadly. Also, with some of the changes, including, I think, beech, American beech is an important food source for ruffed grouse. Beech bark blister, which is a disease that we deal with on the properties around here, that weakens the tree and reduces how much beech nuts are produced. Eventually none once the disease gets so bad. Now I'm about to get depressing because we're going to talk about aerial insectivores. We are in an insect apocalypse. There's no other way. And it was actually finally quantified by a German study that called it the windshield effect. How many people remember pulling over on the side of the road to wipe the bugs off the windshield or scrubbing it at a gas station? Now you drive in the evening in the summer, you're like, oh, I got bug juice right there. And it is always the one right in front of your line of sight. And we'll complain about it because it's right there. But there's no pulling over. I mean, there's still some mayfly hatches in Western Maine, but essentially there are a lot less bugs than there used to be. Eastern whippoorwill, a nocturnal bird that feeds mostly on moths. That's the breeding bird survey. I'm going to talk about these together because you're going to see some parallels, especially with common nighthawk, which feeds at night but is also more crepuscular, meaning active at dawn and dusk. Breeding bird survey. Whippoorwills and common nighthawks breed in Maine. They need undeveloped forests. They also do poorly, whippoorwills are ground nesters, do really poorly around us because of cats and outdoor and native predators. Nighthawks actually used to do really well around us. When I did a college road trip with a girlfriend in college, and we went to minor league baseball stadiums, and all my early state lists, common nighthawk from whatever minor league game I was on, including my early trip to Maine at the Portland Sea Dogs, there were common nighthawks flying around the light stanchions, eating the moths that were attracted to it. However, in urban areas, common nighthawks nested on gravel roofs where that egg would be perfectly camouflaged and away from land-based predators. We don't use gravel on roofs anymore. And the few that still have gravel have even more herring gulls. Herring gulls started colonizing the old port and nesting on roofs. A really interesting study that's being done on looking at how successful they are. But that's not great if you're a nighthawk nest, because a herring gull is going to eat the nest. The problem is herring gulls took over after we started losing gravel roofs. So I don't blame herring gulls. It's just going to prevent a common nighthawk from adapting to a non-gravel roof, which essentially just get too hot and too cold. Development and fragmentation, but like whippoorwill, their wintering habitat in the Amazon's in trouble. It's not going to be a rainforest much longer at the current trends. The amount of pesticide use used in Central and South America, we are destroying insect populations around the world, especially in the tropics, and that's all compounding with climate change. Chimney swift. How many people grew up with these in their chimney? One, make it two. They are almost exclusively reliant on chimneys because we don't grow our old trees big enough to hollow out into essentially a wooden chimney. So they took to nesting in big brick chimneys. We don't build big brick chimneys anymore. We build them out of cinder block. Cinder block are harder for the little feet of chimney swifts to grip on. But you could go to an old mill town that has restored their smokestacks and still don't see chimney swifts like you used to. Again, a bird that eats flying insects that is bottoming out, and pesticides are the #1 cause of this. They also are losing those natural, the big old trees, and anthropogenic nesting sites. We knocked down a big old mill. There was a school in Brunswick, the high school? I think it was the high school. Mary Meeting Audubon tried to raise money to build a big brick chimney to replace the old one that was coming down. They didn't raise enough. They built a cinder block chimney, and you can't have chimney swifts on cinder blocks. The other thing is, here's an example where the increased severity of storm and weather uncertainty affects chimney swifts. Oh, again, I horrible at dates. It was around 2010. We had a massive, like late August, early September, coastal hurricane. And it deposited tens of thousands of chimney swifts from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland. It picked them up as they were probably crossing the Gulf of Mexico or off the eastern seaboard and dumped them way too far north, and people were finding piles of them dead in fireplaces. They didn't have the food had disappeared by then, and they got displaced. Those increased severity of storms, winds don't blow birds very often, but this is one of the birds that gets displaced by it. Aerial insectivores are in real trouble. And that means if we lose them and then we have other insects, those insects are going to rebound from lack of predation. And that includes the things that eat what we want, like our forests and our food. Canada jay, 10 years ago, actually 3 years ago, was also called gray jay. This is where the Christmas bird count is showing a steady decline, but the breeding bird survey has shown recent increase and also at least more steady. And this is, I think, due to how many Christmas counts occurred near people. Canada jay is no longer found in southern Maine or at the coast of eastern Maine. And it's becoming rare in central Maine. 10 years ago, you could find them right outside of Bangor in Suncaze National Wildlife Refuge. You don't see them there anymore. Here is one of the few examples where we have hard proof of climate change completely eliminating a species. And that's because refrigeration. Canada jays, like all corvids, blue jays, crows, but jays store food for the winter. They harvest in the fall, store it in the winter. Blue jays use acorns. Acorns can last 2 or 3 years in storage. Canada jays use spruce and pine nuts. Spruce and pine nuts do not last very long when they get wet. They either start growing or they spoil. Canada jays nest very early, often on nests in April. You know there's April snowstorms if you live in Rangeley or if you've been to Rangeley, and those snowstorms prevent a bird from foraging. Their young might be out. If those young are out, they need to be fed. Canada jays rely on the food they stored from the fall to feed the young in the spring. If they go to a rotting log and that log did not freeze solid, those pine nuts have rotted. And what they're finding is the adults go to a food source and it's spoiled or just disappeared because it rotted away. They don't have that early season food. So this is where we'll sometimes see Canada jays, and this is actually as part of this increase. I've noticed Canada jays are becoming a little more regular in the lowlands of Rangeley again, in near well-landscaped neighborhoods. I wonder if supplemental feeding is helping them in early spring. However, in most of Maine, right when Canada jays would be needing that supplemental food, bears are coming out. And you just can't have a bird feeder in a neighborhood in Rangeley once the bears come out, because they'll knock it over every night and it's not good for the bears or anyone else. And a lot of towns have banned it. Luckily, not an issue at the coast yet. Occasionally, a young male wanders through Cumberland, knocks over a few feeders, keeps moving, not the end of the world, causes massive panic, but really it's just a young male looking for a female and he's going to keep walking. Unless it's on next door, and then the world is going to end. But the decreased bird feeding, I wonder, could that be impacting Canada jays, especially in early spring, because bears are waking up earlier and are waking up when Canada jays need supplemental food to make up for the spoiled spruce seeds in their cache. The reason I almost feel like I'm justifying that, that's just, these things will balance out, figure it out. Boreal chickadee lives in the same habitat as Canada jays. There's not much question what's happening there. A few years ago, there was a push in Maine to make boreal chickadee the state bird, or technically define the state bird, because it's officially just the chickadee. And there was a there was a push to get Maine to define it. And there were people involved, and there were state legislators in Augusta arguing one or the other. Birders were for boreal chickadee because it was unique. A lot of people were still fighting the war with Massachusetts, which also has black-capped chickadees. Why would we want the state bird? I was on team black-cap all the way. In fact, it was my moment of fame when I got to be interviewed by National All Things Considered as a representative for the black-capped chickadee. Ironically, not surprisingly, they called me while I was leading a tour. Ironically, it was while I was leading a tour in Hawaii. And I was on a mountain, so I had to justify the wind behind me. And I'm hiding behind our van trying to conduct this interview. They never said I was in Hawaii, because part of my argument is that black-capped chickadees don't leave the state. They don't need to escape the winters, and here I am in Hawaii. But I like boreal chickadee, but part of the reason was boreal chickadees are declining so rapidly. It was to bring attention to the declining species. The Christmas bird counts and the breeding bird surveys are showing steep declines of this bird. It's a northern bird whose ranges are retracting. And as we kept talking about southern birds whose range are expanding, we have a lot of northern birds whose range are contracting. And boreal chickadee is maybe one of the prime examples of that. It's hard. They don't use feeders very much, even if there are feeders nearby. They don't use roadkill. They can tolerate some development, but they like unbroken spruce forest. And as our forest structure changes, that seems to affect them. They're hard to find in Sunkays, which is a place I go regularly because it's one of the closest boreal transition habitats of this area. Sunkays just north of Orono. They're gone there. Heavy amount of forestry and clear cutting is changing that forest because we're selecting or not selecting for certain species, using different cutting, chemical, and harvesting regimes. It may also be the loss of old growth spruce fir forest. There's just not much of that left. And maybe this bird needs that type of forest more than others. I'm going to talk about a few more examples here. Or a few more examples later, I'll talk about that old growth forest thing. Here's one that's, I think, declining, but is a good thing. Or I have good news about upland sandpiper. We seem to have stabilized it. And this is 100% due to conservation. If we didn't conserve the Kennebunk Plains, which is a state wildlife management area, and we didn't burn the blueberry barrens there, if the state didn't work with airports to keep certain areas mowed and unmowed, and if we didn't work with blueberry farmers in Washington County, this bird would be gone as a breeding bird in Maine. but we've stabilized it at low levels. But maybe the increase was due to our opening up of the forest again. And now we've stabilized it where, because we've conserved that habitat, we might be doing all right. The more I talk, the more I cough. I'm healthy. It's just what happens. This is why my constant supply of cough drops when I'm giving a lecture. We have protected them, but we're also worried about land use changes in South America. Mostly overgrazing is a concern for most species, but overgrazing a former savanna is actually good for an upland sandpiper. Not much else, but it's possible that deforesting the Amazon to grow cheap beef to sell at McDonald's could help this bird. Still not eating cheap beef at McDonald's, but it's most of the east is declining. We've just found a way to stabilize it here in Maine. And we can have very productive agriculture alongside upland sandpipers with slight changes in mowing regimes and protection of those habitats. My concern about my positive views of upland sandpiper is this is one that surprised me when I started looking at graphs, is the Vesper sparrow. It looks similar to song sparrows, which are all over our yards right now, but we'll get into the ID lesson on another lecture. But Vesper sparrow is a scrub specialist that lives mostly at the edges of grasslands and open areas. There's the breeding bird survey for Vesper sparrow. The reason this surprised me is if you go to the Kennebunk Plains, which in western Kennebunk, it's arguably the most common bird there. And it still is the most common bird in the plains. But it's a habitat specialist, which means away from that habitat, it's becoming less common. Used to be a bird that was in power line corridors, but now the primary way of keeping corridors open is aerial spraying of herbicides as opposed to mechanical mowing. Mechanical mowing can actually produce, in a power line, good Vesper sparrow habitat. Chemical use does not. I don't know what's causing this decline. I haven't read much about it. It is, I believe it's now protected by the state, but it seems to be this overall scrub habitat loss due to reforestation, development, and climate change affecting that forest structure. But it seems so precipitous that there might be something else involved. But I do wonder if this is a thermal requirement. This bird is contracting its range. My goal was to have this discussion earlier before I bored everyone, but I knew I talked too long at each slide. When we think of migration, we think of the pretty birds that winter in South America and Central America, the neotropic migrants, the birds that fly from their homes in the New World tropics, neotropics, to take advantage of our summer abundance of insects. And after the last ice age, as the glaciers retreated, those neotropical migrants went a little further and further every 1,000, 10,000, now 300,000 years, taking advantage of that wealth of insects and lack of competition. Birds like the Swainson's thrush on the left and the chestnut-sided warbler on the right. Yellow warbler left, American redstart top right. I can do a whole presentation on just neotropical migrants, but here's a neotropical migrant, a red-eyed vireo, that is showing continent-wide increases. In fact, there are a lot more red-eyed vireos now in my local parks than there were 20 years ago. We don't know why, because that bucks a trend that is really scary. And I don't even know where to start this slide. Like, I had to keep it on one slide. They're losing habitat on the breeding grounds. They're losing habitat in migration. They're losing habitat in winter. There's a lot of pesticide use, increasing amounts in South America. The changing patterns and intensities of weather systems affecting migration, climate change in general, collisions. 1.3 billion birds a year are killed at windows. 3.4 billion birds a year are killed by cats. Those are things that we could prevent that are affecting disproportionate amounts of migrants. Neotropical migrants made the news last year because a study was done that showed North America has lost 1/3, or approximately 3 billion birds, since 1970. The majority of those birds we lost are the neotropical migrants. The birds that have made up the difference are cardinals and chickadees and Carolina wrens moving north. One of the big reasons for this and why this is so complicated is spring phenology. especially affecting the budworm warblers. These are birds, these are warblers, Cape May on the top, below it is bay-breasted, blackpoll on the right. Let me talk a little bit about, I'll focus just on blackpoll warbler, but this is a group of neotropical warblers that specialize on the caterpillars that eat baby leaves, budworms. Red oak in Maine hosts over 300 species of native caterpillar. An introduced ginkgo biloba, 1, which produces more bird food. Obviously, the native red oak. The budworm warblers rely on budworms to feed their young and to migrate. And they follow what we call the green wave, the emergence of leafage as spring progresses. The problem is, so this blackpoll warbler is such a finely tuned machine. It is evolved for at least 300,000 years to slowly ride that green wave north and escape while they still can in the fall. Blackpoll warbler, bird about the size of a titmouse, maybe a little smaller, flies nonstop for almost two and a half days from the New England coast to the northern coast of South America. Nonstop. I'm trying to remember, there was a stat of what the miles per gallon would be if a blackpoll warbler was a car. And it was something like 2,000 miles per gallon. It's just sort of insane to think about the fuel efficiency of these things. The blackpoll warbler needs to follow north. And what we had found is that as the springs have come earlier, and the budworm, so the leaf bud oak is a perfect example. You know how tough a red oak leaf is to tear? You know how some hang on a tree all winter? There's like a waxy coating that keeps that leaf tough. The oak isn't doing that for fun. It's doing it to combat all the bugs that want to eat it. Young leaves emerging from the buds are full of nutrition, just like a chicken egg. There's lots of nutrition in the yolk. Think of that as the bud. Everyone wants eggs for breakfast. Everyone wants caterpillars for breakfast if you're a bird. When that bud emerges, all these caterpillars rush to eat that baby leaf while they still can. The leaves come out, as we know, and we know by maple syrup season is getting earlier. Those leaves are coming out earlier because sap is flowing earlier because that's temperature dependent. A blackpoll warbler in the Amazon has no idea how warm it has or hasn't been in Maine. It's timing its migration. It's timing its fat deposition to allow it to migrate based on changes in day length. The one thing we haven't found a way to screw up yet, except in a classic Simpsons episode. It all comes back to a Simpsons episode. As the blackpoll warblers move north, they need caterpillars to fuel their migration. If they're behind the green wave because it was an early spring, they'll survive, get to the breeding grounds, but if they didn't eat enough caterpillars on the way, they don't have the strength to hold a territory and breed successfully. So birders go to Evergreen Cemetery, complain about how many fewer blackpolls we see, because by the time they get here, the leaves are already out. And that makes it harder to spot in the tops of the tallest oaks where budworm warblers like to be. Those leaves being too big to see the birds means those leaves are too big for those caterpillars to be feeding on them. And a lot of that food has already gone by. Also, these birds need budworms, specifically the spruce budworms, to feed their young to produce more Cape May, bayberries, and blackpoll warblers. Spruce budworms have natural cycles that wave across the continent in massive outbreaks. And as they move east and west, they deforest denude mass amounts of forest. That regenerates the boreal forest. Without that regeneration, you don't get the same amount of biomass. You don't get the same ability to sequester carbon. You name it, the boreal forest needs to have these cycles. Well, that doesn't work well if you're trying to plan how much wood chip pulp you're going to have to keep a paper mill going. So we apply chemicals to spruce budworms. In the 70s and 80s, we sprayed a lot of the northern forests with chemicals. That depressed the cycle of spruce budworms. We've learned a little bit, but we're affecting that natural cycle through pesticides and intensity of forestry, and as climate change throws off migration phenology. Then as the bird heads back south, there's stronger hurricanes and storms. There's different weather. There's less places to stop. There's more lighted towers. There's all different problems, and all the budworms are showing decreases. However, some, like Cape May warbler, have started to see a resurgence in Maine because spruce budworms have had an outbreak in Quebec that have spread into Western Maine. As spruce budworms come back east, if we don't douse them all with chemicals, and at least we don't tend to use as bad of a pesticide now as we did in the 70s on them, these birds might come back, and we might produce enough to counteract some of the declines. We'll see. I could go into the weeds on these species, but this is one that I'm going to say questionable status, although there's not much question on the Christmas bird count. Who grew up with evening grosbeaks at their feeders? Who had evening grosbeaks at their feeders this winter? Pretty typical. They are not coming as far south as they used to. Therefore, the Christmas bird count has shown a steady decline. They are cyclical. And for a long time, and I remember in the 80s when there were still evening grosbeaks coming down to central New Jersey once in a while, everyone talked about evening grosbeaks, how there used to be more. And by the time I studied them in college in the 90s, I was learning how few there were and seeing few once I had an ability to take a drive and go look for birds. These natural cycles coincide almost perfectly with explosions of spruce budworms in eastern North America. This apparently finch that eats fruit in the winter apparently needs spruce budworms in order to feed its young. That's how valuable spruce budworms are to the boreal forest that produces so many more birds. The natural cycle of spruce budworms are being held down by chemical use, by forestry changes. But evening grosbeaks, and we used to say, you know what, they're okay. They're a western bird that spread east to take advantage of budworms. Then they retracted back west and everything will be fine. The problem is that explains that, doesn't explain this. I'm part of the Evening Grosbeak Working Group, which is a nationwide project looking at evening grosbeak populations. And we're finding that it's not just a range contraction of birds going back to a core range. It's declines throughout all of North America's population. Food crop availability. I'm worried about evening grosbeaks that do come to Maine in winter because emerald ash borer is here. They eat a lot of ash seeds in winter. It's a really important food source. If we lose all our ashes, and we know Portland is cutting a whole bunch down in the neighborhood now, which may or may not control emerald ash borer, but hollowed out dead ashes are wonderful at falling on cars and people and houses. So we don't really want that. We also, as long as emerald ash borer keeps spreading north, which only a reduction in the pace of climate change is going to stop them, we're going to lose things that feed birds like evening grosbeaks. We're also, through this research group, finding that evening grosbeaks are particularly susceptible to window and cat predation, likely because in winter they use bird feeders a lot. And poor placement of bird feeders brings birds that have never seen a building, let alone glass, into proximity of danger, which is something that we work at our store to eliminate, and we could talk about in solutions and at another time. We'll talk about solutions a little bit later. Rusty blackbird. It's a blackbird. We think of blackbirds as birds of open spaces and common and abundant. Well, rusty blackbird is a bird of the spruce forest. There's your breeding bird survey that's declined. We think this might be a budworm specialist, or it needed budworms to deforest enough to cause spruce to regenerate so thickly and densely as to hide their nests. We're not quite sure, but we're seeing a recent rebound, and that recent rebound may be as those spruce budworms spread east. We're getting optimistic that rusty blackbirds could be coming back, and we can adjust forestry practices, eliminating deforestation of old growth black spruce can really help a rusty blackbird. We also lose habitat. They like riverland bottoms in winter. Those tend to get developed too often. Historically, now we're understanding the value of floodplains. And if you don't believe the value of floodplain, come to my backyard this morning, and you'll see what the Androscoggin River floodplain does and why our house is set back. The other thing that's always concerned me, and we haven't been able to quantify, is in the southeast U.S., especially along the Gulf Coast. The USDA Agriculture Wildlife Services Division, which I'd argue is the most corrupt and useless government organization out there, in part because they answer to no one, including national environmental laws. They gas, using toxic gases, hundreds of thousands of blackbirds every winter in the name of agricultural protection. That's been going on for a long time. Rusty blackbirds will not be in a farm field eating anything we eat, but they spend the night with the birds that are in the farm fields, common grackles, red-winged blackbirds in particular, especially in rice-growing regions like Louisiana. We wonder how many rusty blackbirds are killed when they destroy these roosts. The habitat loss and migratory stopovers, but maybe none of it matters. Maybe we just need more spruce budworms. We have healthy spruce forests being eaten by healthy spruce budworms. Maybe rusty blackbird could come back. There was a study one year that showed a rusty blackbird have lost their spruce forest, so moved into clear cuts, and there's higher nest predation in a regenerating clear cut than an old growth spruce bog. That study has been questioned by methodology, but might still be in the right idea of how we can make small changes to affect the habitat. I'm getting there, I promise. Sharp-shinned hawk, the smaller member of the Cooper's hawk. Christmas bird counts are increasing. The breeding bird survey in Maine is stable. At our Hawk Watch, it's showing a slight increase. Everywhere else in the country, if you talk to anyone who looks at raptors, they say sharp-shinned hawk is decreasing. The Cape May Hawk Watch, it's the second fastest decreasing species after American kestrel. This may be good news. Maybe they're not decreasing. Maybe they're doing what we're calling short stopping. They're not flying as far as they used to because they don't have to due to climate change, due to reforestation, due to bird feeding. They hunt their feeders, and if there's a feeder in northern Maine, why keep flying to a feeder in Massachusetts when you got all your birds right there? So we don't know because there's not as much research being done on this species. Again, Cooper's hawk could be blamed. I'm going to blame the shifting ranges where sharpshins are retracting. Cooper's hawks are filling that unoccupied niche. And they just simply may be a northern bird who's no longer coming as far south, both to breed and to winter. We're not quite sure. Those are some examples. The birds that are declining, I could keep going on, but I wanted to bring some that showed some of the different things that are part of the equation. The reasons for concern, there's more of us, and the more of us there is, the more all these problems are compounded. Overpopulation is it's a scary word in environmentalism because you never want to tell people there are too many of you. But it's a topic that has to be involved because the more of us there are, the more problems there is for everything. Our climate is in crisis. If you don't believe it, have you stepped outside in the last few weeks? Things have changed. We are using more chemicals than we ever have, and I firmly believe neonicotinoid pesticides, which are ubiquitous right now, will make DDT look like just, that was a temporary blip. Our landscapes are changing. We're increasing development. For some of it we do need housing. We know our state is desperate for housing to keep our economy going, to keep our families together. But how we do it and where we do it can have an impact. Up to 3.8 to 4.2 billion birds a year killed by outdoor cats, 1.3 billion birds killed at windows. We're running out of birds to lose to those preventable, really, sources. And it's slow to make positive change. You can't just kill all the cats tomorrow. I'm not even advocating for that. Although people who know me might think I am. But it's not going to happen. Even if you thought that was a good idea, which Australia is trying, because Australia is not a cultural pet. It's a massive invasive species, wiping off birds, mammals, and reptiles from the face of the earth. And Australia is literally trying to kill all the cats. They're not going to do it, and they know that, but they're going to try. So it's not really a joke because it's being tried. And cats have wiped more species off the face of the earth than any other species other than rats. I would say humans have are the cause of both of those because they bring the cats. I don't blame a cat. It's not the cat's fault. It's not the rat's fault. We brought them there. Also, a lot of people it's hard to care. You're working hard to make ends meet and put food on the table. The last thing you're thinking about is whether or not your decision is impacting a neotropical migrant flying overhead. I'm hopelessly optimistic, as most birders are, because we see things that get people excited, like birds. You all being here is the first step, raising awareness. I'm probably preaching to the choir in a lot of places, to a lot of people here, but hopefully I can teach you some of the small changes that can make a big difference. I'm a strong believer that nature will persist, which is why I'll fight a wind turbine on Monhegan. Not because I don't believe in wind energy as being potential future, but poorly sited projects, whether wind, solar, or a new dam, or anything else that can impact biodiversity, doesn't give nature a chance to survive. Look at all those birds that are increasing. Those birds are evolving. I think eastern bluebird has evolved to become a backyard bird. That evolution is happening rapidly. If we kill all of the birds, they're not going to get a chance to evolve. Nature will persist. The whole idea that, we're destroying the planet. We're destroying our civilization and humanity. The planet's going to do just fine without us. In fact, better without us. And remember, birds are dinosaurs. Dinosaurs did not become extinct. Birds lived through a meteor that completely changed the climate within a very short amount of time. Birds will have shown an ability to adapt if we give them the chance. We give them the chance by getting to work. And we'll get to work in lots of different ways. And if everyone takes home one thing that they could do slightly differently, then we can actually make a real difference because we give the birds a chance. They're going to persist. It's hard to accept any chemical use in our backyard outside of very targeted with invasive species. There are exceptions to every rule. But if you want a perfectly green, homogeneous lawn, there's no way to do it in Maine without chemicals. And if you want that, you're going to be destroying birds and the food they depend on. If we eliminate chemicals from our backyards first and then move on from there, everything we do in our backyard has an impact beyond the backyard. Douglas Talame has written several books, and his newest one called Homegrown National Park is his theory that if we all treat our backyards as if it was a national park, the amount of species that can recover, starting with having a seed fly out of your yard and land in a ditch of a native plant versus an invasive. There are exceptions to this rule too, but native is always better. When you go to plant something this spring, plant a native species. Buy it from a place that has promised they don't use neonicotinoid pesticides. Easier said than done, but we have to get rid of neonicotinoids in our backyards because the reason this chemical is so pervasive is, and it's being used as brown-tailed moths. We're inoculating a tree against brown-tailed moth. That is wonderful snake oil speak for putting chemicals into the tree system that kills everything. We hear the word inoculation. We're like, great, I'll get a flu vaccine and a COVID vaccine and be inoculated against what that treats. This inoculation on that red oak is treating brown-tailed moths. That sounds wonderful, but it's simply false. The places that spray the most chemicals seem to have the densest population of brown-tailed moths. It's because we've eliminated all the potential native competitors. We need to reduce those. And the other thing, I mentioned 300 species of moths on a red oak, one on a ginkgo biloba. I need a new tree in my front yard. Which am I going to promote putting in? There are some things we could do as consumers, and I'll plug our store. Bird-friendly coffee. Sounds nice. People think, oh, birds eat that coffee? No. Most cheap coffee is grown by mowing down the rainforest, burning it, putting carbon in the atmosphere, eliminating the soil's potential to hold carbon. We plant rows of a certain variety of beans. We throw a bunch of chemicals on it. Multinational corporations bring big equipment, kick the people out, and we send cheap coffee to chains that occur at every corner in New England, for example. Or we buy coffee as it's intended to be grown, which is in the shade. And the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center has certified certain farms that have produced not just good coffee that's organic and fair trade for the benefits of giving people a fair living wage, keeping chemicals out of the environment, but also in a way that mimics native forest structure. A well-run, organic, shade-grown, bird-friendly coffee plantation is nearly as valuable to native and migratory birds in the tropics as virgin rainforest. But people can make a living from there, and a fair living, because in the 80s, there was the idea that you just kicked everyone out of the forest, put up a fence around it, and everything would be fine. Well, it's too late for that, and it's also not fair. We can change the coffee we drink and save millions of birds. There's an unofficial proposal that magnolia warbler, a bird that we like to see here in Maine, doesn't really have any interest in magnolias. Might land in one once in a while. The first one ever described was shot out of a magnolia tree in migration. That's why it's called that. They breed in spruce forest. They winter in densest numbers in shade-grown coffee plantation. I think it should be called the coffee warbler to make that connection. We'll see. There's other battles we fought in the bird naming world right now. I'm not going to get my coffee warbler anytime soon. Window collisions. Keep your screen up all year. So every few years, you got to go to Ace Hardware and replace it. $20, you saved a lot of birds. I was talking when we were building a house, we built the first bird-friendly house in Maine, where 100% of our glass reduces bird strikes, or was certified to reduce bird strikes, by breaking up the reflection on the outer surface of glass. We can do that with different aftermarket stickers and different decals, and I have a whole presentation on window collisions I'll save for yet another day. We have a whole series of presentations now. But essentially, stopping birds from hitting our windows will save as many as 1.3 billion birds a year. There is no other, I have nothing against cats. I really don't. They are devastating our ecology, and outdoor cats simply cannot be tolerated as part of nature because they're not. There's complications, it's not as easy. And it's, for me, what I get frustrated, it's not bird people, cat people. It's how would you let your cat outside? Coyotes and great horned owls and stupid people and kids and cars and maybe someone on their property patrolling the boundary for cats. You name it, there's so many threats, and the health of cats is simply better inside. It's just not good for a cat to be outside because they're getting into a whole lot of things other than nests of great catbirds, for example. Local activism to minimize development and impacts in or near key habitat. Thanks to the Chevegan Cumberland Land Trust, we have a lot of great properties protected around here. And supporting land trusts in Maine is a really good way to protect key habitat. This is not don't build anywhere NIMBYism. It's don't build here because it's really important for X, Y, and Z that lives here. We can still have housing in ways, and my degree is in environmental policy with a focus in wildlife management and urban planning. And the urban planning thing, I didn't get nearly enough credits and was mostly about building bigger buildings at the time. We know how to have housing and birds, and there's pushes in cities to have bird-safe building guidelines. New York City, you can't build a new building within certain requirements and parameters that doesn't, especially near a park, that doesn't have bird-safe glass. The Jacob Javits Convention Center was a notorious killer of hundreds to thousands of birds every year. They needed to renovate it. They decided to do a demonstration project. There hasn't been a bird strike documented in 3 years now. We know we can do these things. It costs a little more, but I'll tell you from my own house, we built a new house, 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, a lot of windows. The bird safe glass added 2% to our total building costs. That's, when we're counting every penny to build low-income housing, maybe that's not the place to do it, but we could keep screens up all year on those houses. So there's lots of different ways, and it starts as simple as your window, your beloved pet, your cup of coffee, which I'm not up here right now without my cup of coffee or 2 in the morning, especially after leading a bird walk to start the day. So those are things that can make little changes, but we do need to conserve land, and that's important for both limiting climate change impacts and also giving birds refuges to produce more birds so that we can fill in the gaps in between. I wanted to spend a lot of time for questions because I know this is going to bring up more questions than answers, but I will still be happy to take questions. But I've taken a lot of your time today on a fairly lovely Saturday where a lot of you are probably going home to do storm cleanup, getting ready for the next storm. But thank you all for coming. Penny, thank you for having me. Thanks to the library for having me. And thanks everyone for coming. It's the first step. And I'm happy to do this.